Hello, I'm David Breeden. I'm the senior minister at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, a historically humanist congregation, and this is Coffee and Wisdom. This week we've been talking about the social gospel. I've been calling it Gimme, that old-time social gospel, because it is a 19th century movement that still has implications, as we'll talk about, but very much part of the post-Civil War progressive era. One of the main social gospelers in the Unitarian and Universalist traditions, I talked about John Haynes Holmes yesterday as a Unitarian. The Universalist was Clarence Skinner, 1881 to 1949. He and John Haynes Holmes were very good friends and worked together quite a bit on their joint projects, as a matter of fact, both as social gospelers. Although Skinner remained a very strong Universalist proponent, as we will talk about. He became a professor of applied Christianity at Crane Theological School at Tufts and developed a long relationship with Tufts University. Applied Christianity, what the heck is that? Well, it was a term invented by Washington Gladden, the social gospeler who really started the whole thing. I talked about him way back last Monday. So there is a historical continuum here. And Skinner was very fortunate in that, but because he developed a relationship as an academic with Tufts University, he was more protected than was John Haynes Holmes from various repercussions for what his very radical beliefs would lead to. He, for example, like Holmes, he was a pacifist in the First World War. He was a great supporter of Sacco and Vanzetti, and he too dropped out of the formal movement and became this independent minister and founded the Community Church of Boston in 1920, very much modeled on the John Haynes Holmes congregation over in New York City. So they're having these ideas simultaneously, although John Haynes Holmes is very much a Unitarian, really only marginally a theist. He says God is poetry, not theology. Whereas with Skinner, we really have someone who we would think of as a mystic, definitely a mystic Christian, although of a very liberal sort. So the social implications of universalism in 1915, this book comes out just before the First World War, in which Skinner writes, the true social objective is the perfecting of human character by the progressive improvement of those conditions and environments which are within the social control. Very in the social gospel channel, very much also in the salvation through character idea that the Unitarians are, mainline Unitarians are pursuing during this time period. The issue that Skinner was facing, because he really loved universalism, and I do need to remind those who don't know that universalism and Unitarianism did not combine until 1961. So though they were going down similar paths at this time, they were not in any way affiliated. So the issue for universalism was that it had been huge. It was the fourth or fifth largest Protestant denomination previous to the Civil War. The numbers are very difficult to come up with, actually, but somewhere in that range, it was big and growing before the Civil War. But thereafter, it dropped off precipitously for a couple of different reasons. One reason being that other mainline denominations stopped talking about hell, even those that maybe still believed in it as a theological doctrine. They stopped talking about it. Hellfire and brimstone simply becomes unpopular among mainline Protestant denominations after the Civil War. So universalism loses its main punch, in other words. So what else is it going to be? Is it going to survive into the future? So Skinner set about figuring out how universalism could survive into the future with more than just the idea of universal salvation. So 1917, so we're going into the First World War, and Skinner did know that the war was looming and that the U.S. would probably get involved. And then when the document comes out, indeed the U.S. is in the First World War. So he writes this: in the present general confusion of thought, we deem it wise to restate the essential principles of the Universalist faith and their social implications in relation to modern life. So, yes, Universalism does still have some meaning within the larger social structure, and I'm going to tell you what that is. And guess what? It's going to be very much about the social gospel movement of the time. So he goes on to say, we proclaim the doctrine of the essential divinity of man, of God's universal fatherhood, and of man's universal brotherhood. Now, these actually are terms that are coming out of a lot of Unitarian writers of the day, but he's getting on that particular bandwagon because it is still theistic in its main thrust there. We hold, therefore, that all systems that attempt to load the blame, odd, kind of vernacular from the time, load the blame on Adam, upon Satan, or upon human depravity, tend to weaken human self-respect and to lead men away from the discovery and cure of the real causes of human sin and misery. So all of that stuff about original sin, etc., nope, that actually is beside the point and kind of leads us away from the real point. In view of these conclusions, which we believe were plainly taught by the great founder of Christianity, that would happen to be Jesus, by the way, we insist that we should not judge one another anymore, but rather that we should remove the stumbling block and the barriers to the kingdom of heaven out of our brother's way. I put in the little symbol for universalism that appears during this time period. You see the circle, which is universal, and then the cross, which is off center. It is no longer going to be the center of universalism, but it's going to be the basis of universal thought. Also notice the great founder of Christianity being Jesus, and therefore the social gospel that as this kingdom of heaven idea, because actually the great founder of Christianity is Paul, right? But this is the way that Skinner wants to set this up. We conclude also that democracy is not an inherent right, but also, not only, but also a divinely imposed duty. We find that none of us liveth or dieth to himself, and that true men and women should consider nothing foreign to them, which is common to humanity. So, all right, so democracy is divinely inspired, and it is your absolute obligation to work within the democratic framework. A very large theological claim that I think is a little bit debatable, but there you go. This is how he is setting this up in 1917. We brand as infamous the practice of subordinating human interests to business interests, and we urge that the national government should not hesitate to assume immediate control of the management of the production and distribution of the necessities of life to prevent want and starvation and the economic enslavement of the people to predatory interests in time of crisis. This is one of the things that would get him very much in trouble. He would be very unpopular among the run-of-the-mill Universalists of the day, and he would have been drummed out of most of the congregations of the day, probably, but he was in the privileged position of basically making his money as an academic, which he was claiming academic freedom, and Tufts University was saying, yeah, you go on, that's fine. We assert that the claims of the religion of Jesus, the religion of democracy, and of international brotherhood transcend all the claims of race and of nationality, and that the highest form of patriotism demands we endeavor to place our nation in the position of one that seeks its permanent glory in subordinating selfish interests to those of the coming federation of the world, in which the common sense of most shall hold a fretful realm in awe. That's a Tennyson poetry quote, by the way. So you see this idea of the federation of the world, one world government idea, very much at this time period, it's going to be perceived as the internationalia. It's going to be perceived as a Soviet-style takeover of the world as one world. Again, not a popular thing to say. Program, and this is part of the text, by the way. So here's the program of the new universalism. Through all the agencies of the church, we shall endeavor to educate and inspire the community and the nation to a keener social consciousness and a truer vision of the kingdom of God on the earth. And again, remember, this is total social gospel. That's exactly what they're trying to do, is create the kingdom of God on earth. Democracy, in order to be complete, must be economic and social as well as political. We therefore declare for the democratization of industry and of land, and for the establishment of cooperation. Again, very socialist slash communist kind of talk here, very much in with the general ideas among very liberal theologians of the day, going into the First World War, coming out of the Second World War, not popular at all. We would condemn those forms of private monopoly, which make it difficult or impossible for men to attain their common share of the common heritage of the earth. And especially do we condemn those forms of exploitation, which in time of national stress, war, by the way, and suffering, make the few wealthy at the cost of the many. So yes, he would not think that a Facebook monopoly was a good idea. Free discussion is the soul of democracy and the guarantee of our liberties. It should therefore be maintained in our churches, colleges, and public platforms, and limited only by, it should be by, mutual self-respect and courtesy. So free exchange of ideas, absolutely essential. The only thing we have to worry about is being respectful and courteous to others. Otherwise, all bets are off. We can talk about these dangerous ideas. While cooperating to the fullest extent possible with the various forms of charity, relief, and correction, this is the Band-Aid, as we call it nowadays in social justice work. We recognize they do not eradicate fundamental causes. We would mobilize the forces of our church against the causes which create misery, disease, accidents, ignorance, and crime, and summon all our strength to the establishment of justice, education, and social righteousness. The Universalist Church offers a complete program for completing humanity. And here it is. By golly, the first is an economic order, which shall give to every human being an equal share in the common gifts of God, and in addition, all that he shall earn by his own labor. So a socialist, basically, economic order is what is a universalist of the future will be asking for, he claims. Second, a social order in which there shall be equal rights for all, special privileges for none, the help of the strong for the weak until the weak become strong. Of course, we have to remember women had not yet been extended suffrage at this point, so the social order very much needs to be updated in these ideas that are floating around in universalism. Third, a moral order in which all human law and action shall be the expressions of the moral order of the universe. Well, that's interesting. What the moral order of the universe is, again, theologically, that's a little bit difficult to figure out, but we'll give him that one. Apparently, he sees that arc of the universe bending toward justice. And fourth, a spiritual order, which shall build out of the growing lives of living men the growing temple of the living God. So notice, growing, living, etc. So Skinner saw the future of universalism as a religion of universals, as he said, transcending all particulars. Nowadays, this idea is very unpopular because it's considered colonialist, this sort of a triumphalist idea of Christianity taking over the world. In those days, it was very much talked about. In essence, Skinner was a mystic, and this is one of the important things to remember when we do talk about him. His idea of the kingdom of God is very mystical in that God is working in the world, unlike what the Unitarians, for the most part, were saying at that time. He was a mystic, and this is a quote, "The unities refer to things as they truly are. The universals refer to things as they ought to be." So crossing the line from the is to the ought, and that's what universalism is going to be about, is last great quote here, there is no middle way. It is greatness, universalism, or perish, he says. And so that is the vision that Reverend Skinner presents as the future of universalism, no longer talking about only heaven and hell and the afterlife, but establishing the kingdom of God on earth according to a sort of mystical moralism that he was seeing. Thanks for listening this week. You can find out lots more about us at firstunitarian.org on Sunday morning at 10:30 a.m. Central Time, Stillness and Movement on Not Marking Time, presented by one of our assistant ministers, Reverend Kelly Clement. That'll be Sunday morning. And next week on Coffee and Wisdom, from social gospel to social witness. As I mentioned before, the social gospel dies after the First World War. In many ways, part of it is implemented with the New Deal, but going into the second half of the 20th century, the social gospel is no longer going to be popular among the various denominations. So how did that change and where did it go next? That's what we'll talk about next week. Have a good weekend. We'll see you Sunday.